Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In this episode, I would like to continue the theme of culture, but this time from the perspective of the effect of culture on the evolution of the brain. In the previous episode, I traced through what I think are some of the evolutionary steps that led to culture basically being invented or discovered by the process of evolution, including the focus towards fewer offspring, which therefore required active steps to make sure those offspring survived, including the egg and the larger land-based sort of repository that reptiles produced, the beginnings of protection of the nest, starting with reptiles which bury the eggs or ultimately will guard the eggs, leading to mammals and birds which actively raise their young, feed them, and mammals in particular, because they are designed to feed the young and through the mammary glands, and that in particular will, I'm a bit distracted by the sun behind me at the moment, sorry. That in turn led to the closer relationship between mother and offspring, which provided a good medium for the evolution of transmitted culture. Another example of culture in mammals, which may not involve quite the extreme sort of cognition that species like monkeys and chimpanzees show in terms of theory of mind, is the culture of the migrating herd, the buffalo and the wildebeest, which do this annual grasslands migration pattern where they follow the climate and the food. Wildebeest are born into that pattern and they persist in the migration. The knowledge about the migration is stored in individual wildebeest, but it's the herd as a whole that acts as a sort of repository so that the migration cannot be lost if one individual dies or even a lot of individuals die. The migration routes become part of a grand pattern of life, and we see similar patterns predate culture. Schooling fish have a sort of collective swarm intelligence which the migrating herd also obey. I'm not claiming there that culture is the only factor, but I am saying that in the terms of mammals, which are clearly capable of learning from one another, that things like migrating herds can also include remembering specifics about the route and how it goes. That can obviously become more sophisticated with large-brained elephants actively planning the route, with larger-brained predators communicating and coordinating the hunt. And I think one of the reasons that predatory species, especially herd or pack predators, have ended up intelligent and leading a lot more into culture is the fact that the coordination problem exists. You can't be a solo hunter. Sorry, I'll flip that around. You can be a solo hunter and learn how to hunt by yourself because you don't have to coordinate with anyone. As soon as you act as a lion pride or a wolf pack or an orca pod in the hunt, or even dolphins, then the cooperation requires a theory of mind. And this is where I want to focus this episode. A big theme in systems philosophy has been the dynamic equilibrium that can drift over time, and we've linked that to evolution. And I have already in the previous episodes identified that a pool of culture is like a local genetic gene pool, an information field that is in dynamic equilibrium between itself and its environment. That dynamic equilibrium is coupled to other dynamic equilibriums. So culture is coupled to climate and the environment, but it's also coupled to the other individuals around you. And in the example of the bird call in the forest, warning not just that species, it's also coupled to the learning dynamics of other minds. It is also coupled to the form and function of the individual. If we have brains that specialize in culture, then brains that can better carry that culture and through that better culture improve their odds of survival, get selected for. Once culture becomes a player in the evolutionary fitness landscape, becomes one of the hills, the optimization variables in the evolutionary search algorithm of life, then culture starts to reflexively determine the sort of hardware that evolution selects for. And this gets into minds, brains, simulations of the environment. In order to act in the world, living systems simulate a portion of that environment, and in a previous episode I have called that the Umwelt, the surrounding world. The brains, or even mechanisms, because even single cells have a version of Umwelt that drives their adaptive behavior. So the mechanisms that generate the Umwelt are structural clearly, as in the case of the cell, where it's the raw biochemical nanomachinery that run in that von Neumann replicator. With minds, the adaptive Umwelt can be simple stimulus response, learning. It can be the structure of the neural circuits that make insects born flyers as soon as they metamorphosize into their winged stage. They don't need to learn to fly like birds. They essentially emerge from the cocoon, wait for the wings to harden, and off they go. The neural circuitry is an analog computer that is pre-wired, pre-configured like the body plan to fly. They can still learn, but most of the intelligence is already built in. The intelligence is in the circuitry. As we go up in terms of complexity, then the degree of learning and intelligence grows. Even before we get to complex cultural species, we see that reptiles can learn. They can learn their environment in terms of where they are, their territory. They can refine ambush or hunting areas. They can build nests and learn what they've built and where they are. And finally, we get on to culture. What we see within the sequence that I followed in evolution, and I've spent quite some time in this series of episodes building foundations, but also building sequence. The search algorithm, like a gamer leveling up, finds new solutions that end up being beneficial to survival, and then builds new branches of the evolutionary tree of life. The simulation discovered the neuron, which was needed for animal bodies. The neuron developed the central nervous system, which gave us the brain. The brain provided a locus for learning and coordination, and in the case of octopus, it can be multiple brains. Even in the case of people, we still have clusters of neurons that handle things we call reflexive responses, coordinate groups of muscles. So we have a central brain, but we still have externalized compute even within our bodies. It's not that everything occurs within the brain. Reflexive circuits are local, muscle control circuits are local. But then finally, evolution built and reflexively coupled through survival, trial and error, to ever more complex and capable central brains coupled to body nervous systems, even in reptiles and presumably dinosaurs, until culture introduced a new dynamic. Not the need to learn within a lifespan, but the ability to carry information in this external cultural field over lifespans. And the nature of learning changed. A lot of this has retraced what I've already talked about in the previous episode. This time the perspective is that nature of learning has continued to reflexively modify the brain, because the brain needs to be capable of both carrying the culture, learning the culture and transmitting the culture. In the process, the Umwelt, the perceived reality of the body-mind complex, has continued to change and evolve. Neurons, which we call mirror neurons, have begun to occur. Mirror neurons aren't some new family of neuron type. They're simply things we discovered where one neuron fires in, for instance, the motor region of the brain of the observer that mirrors the actions being taken by the person or the animal being observed. The brain circuitry that allows cultural transmission evolved so that the circuitry that maps our own movements now map through observation of the other onto those movements. What that does is it changes the movements from simply being a representation of our environment and our potential within it, to abstracting ourselves to another, we suddenly have a theory of another equivalent to ourselves. We have abstracted our bodies mentally in the Umwelt, not as something that we control and learn from the environment as, but as something that we see in another and copy. So when the offspring watches the parent demonstrate a certain behavior, the offspring already has the mental machinery and clarity to be able to equate that behavior to their own behavior. In the debate of consciousness, I think this is a fundamental step of evolution and culture that is often missed, and I bring that explicitly as a paradigm. As culture, especially in groups, becomes more mature, we not only have to abstract our bodies as being equivalent to the body we're observing, we also participate in social hierarchy. Now, Jordan Peterson is famous for his quote that social hierarchy is as ancient as the lobster. There's even a meme that equates him to the lobster for that reason. So social hierarchy, the guarding and holding of territory and resources within the environment, especially by males that are trying to entice females, both to show that they have superior genetics because they can guard the territory against rivals, but also ultimately to hold the resources for the female so that she can put more effort into reproduction and less into foraging. This becomes a dynamic that then flows into culture. Social hierarchies, social bonds, and the cultural theory of mind gets honed when we talk about coordinated foraging and hunting strategies, and especially in things like the chimpanzee, which has been extensively studied. We can see a lot of human behavior already embedded within the chimpanzee's culture in a species that exists before the invention of language and the true leveraging of technology. Arguably, technology itself, it definitely extends back to chimpanzees who use pounding stones to break nuts, who use long pieces of grass as fishing rods in termite mounds, and sticks and stones in battle. So tool use definitely predates humans and language. Arguably, making use of non-biological environmental factors date back way before then. Hermit crabs have co-evolved to use discarded shells instead of growing their own armour. This is a coupling, like the fox and the hare, to the environment, but it's also a sort of evolved biological tool use, not a learnt tool use. Birds that eat marrow from bones, like certain vultures, have learnt to take that bone into the air and drop it over a rock in order to break open the bone and gain access to the rich marrow inside. And I think there is a plausible theory that says that a form of pounding stone using primate also discovered that carrion bones contain rich and non-spoiled, still highly edible form of fat. And that might have been what led our ancestors onto the savannas as scavengers, and also provided a rich niche of an unexploited food source. The main theme of today's episode has been to reflexively couple the evolution of culture with the evolution of mind, and not just brain and brain structure, but also more complex Umwelt concepts, the way that the body-mind perceives and operates in the world. You could say that a dragonfly has a certain Umwelt, which includes its own flying ability, the hunt of its prey, and even the ability to learn how to become better at those things, the seeking out of mates and reproduction even. Those Umwelts have changed and evolved to the stage of mirror neurons, where the brain has body plans, maps of territory, maps of other people's actions through calls, maps of other people's emotional states related to those actions. So when we watch, let's say when a monkey watches another monkey, it can tell whether that monkey is playing or serious because of the way that the troop is calling and vocalizing. So much like a movie soundtrack sets the scene with music and plays upon the same mechanisms that still exist within our minds. The minds of monkeys and other primates, and far beyond that, other mammals and birds, and even other organisms beyond that even, use calls to transmit emotion. That can be just a raw signal of danger that changes perhaps the individual that hears that signal through a hormonal release into an alert state, the fight or flight. You get the squirt of adrenaline, the rise in cortisol, and suddenly the whole thinking mode has changed thanks to the chemistry of the body, and that is preserved even in our minds. So transmission of calls leads to changes in brain states. We have transmission of brain states that predate culture and transmission of brain states that are preserved into culture, and transmission of intent that is linked to those calls. So we can watch two individuals fighting. We can hear the laughter and realize it's a play fight. We can watch the laughter fade and realize that the fight is getting serious. Just like the Hollywood score. There are episodes to be had exploring the equivalence of the behavior and cognition repertoire of the great apes, specifically chimpanzees, but gorillas as well, and baboons. Perhaps not baboons so much because they're solitary and therefore don't have quite the social culture. But chimpanzees and babonos have been studied. They hunt, they war. You have examples of individuals that grew up and were friends, grooming each other. You have examples of troops splitting as they grow to large. The individuals within that troop going from us to us and them, and friends that were grooming, viciously fighting against each other. These are themes that I'm certain will come up at later stages as I take culture through the history of humanity. But for now, I wish to point out that culture co-evolves with minds, co-evolves with bodies, and separating them is useful. Separating them is part of what evolution does when it develops modular frameworks so that bodies can evolve separate to the culture and aren't linked to a particular culture. The hermit crab, for instance, will find it difficult to change its culture, although I've heard hermit crabs can use coconut shells. No, that's octopi, I think. But other objects that's man-made instead of the natural shells. Anyway, this episode has grown long enough. The sun is about to rise here on the Tasman Sea, and this has been another episode of Systems Philosophy.